Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Read It or Don't book group from the Center on Colfax. We are live on Facebook and on YouTube, and glad for everyone who is able to join us. We'll get started here in just a second. My name is Rex Fuller, and I am the CEO at the Center on Colfax. And I'd like to start by reading our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect that the Center on Colfax stands on the unceded traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado, and we recognize Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land and honor their sacrifices and hardships. And we recognize that colonialism continues to affect modern Indigenous people. Tonight, we're going to talk about Becky Chambers' book, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. And I have three folks who are going to join me as part of this discussion. Let's bring them in here. We have Jim Brown, Sarah Kay, and Casey Fazio. So I think I've got a couple people unmuted. Can't unmute because the guests, they chose to mute themselves. Well, that's okay. You'll unmute yourself.
I'm live and loud.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Jim. Why don't you start off and just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm Jim Brown. I am the artistic director for the All Night Alliance. It's a Denver nonprofit organization that supports non-traditional live performers and artists, such as drag performers, burlesque dancers, musicians, that sort of stuff. I am also a tabletop game designer and author of degrees in music and creative writing. And science fiction, fantasy is a massive passion of mine. Some say an insatiable hobby, but I say I could stop anytime. I swear.
Well, thank you. We're glad to have you here tonight. Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
You betcha. So my name is Sarah Kennedy. I'm on the board for All Night Alliance. So I am so pleased to have been invited to be part of tonight's discussion. I'm actually coming to you live. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I'm in one of our amazing queer spaces here called Sidewinders S4200, where I will be hosting an event later tonight. But because it is a wonderful, lively queer space, there's stuff happening around me, which is why sometimes I'll be muted just to make sure that I can be part of the conversation as much as possible. I am a performer here. I do stand-up comedy primarily, but I also do all sorts of other performance too. And I enjoy reading, and I really enjoyed reading this book, so I'm excited to talk about it today.
Well, that's great. Thanks for being here. And Casey, would you like to tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, I work for Denver Public Library. I drive the bookmobile, and I also, like Jim, am an avid tabletop role player. I DM a few different campaigns for a few different groups of people. And I also love sci-fi as well. So,
well, that's great. Thank you all for being a part of the conversation. This event is a partnership with the Center on Colfax and the Denver Public Library. And we've just been really thrilled to have some great partners work with us on that project. I want to, before I forget, give a quick shout out to Devin Cochran, who couldn't be here tonight, but helped with the questions. And also just to Kate Burns, who is just generally awesome and also has been really helpful on this project. Just to talk a little bit about who Becky Chambers is. She grew up in Southern California, was born in 1985. And as a young person, developed a real strong interest in space travel, NASA. She had a lot of family members who were part of NASA. And so she got really fascinated by that and studied it extensively. She also went to the University of San Francisco and studied theater arts. So while she was a performer, she was writing on the side, and she self-published this book in 2014 after raising money on Kickstarter, and it became a huge hit. And now it's become a series of books, which has won a Hugo Award and a lot of other awards, Currently, there are 3 sequels: A Closed and Common Orbit, Record of a Spaceborne Few, The Galaxy and the Ground Within. And then she is working on a final book in the series, which I think may come out later this year, called A Psalm for the Wild Built. She has lived in Iceland and in Scotland, but now she's back in Southern California, living with her Icelandic wife. And I think everybody had a lot of fun reading this book. We've done a lot of different books as part of the book group, some very serious, some kind of whimsical, like this one. I think that there's been a real connection for the LGBT community with sci-fi, and we've. I would love to just sort of hear, to start us off, what you all thought about the book, and if you saw any parallels just right off the bat with issues that might affect the LGBT community, but really just what you thought about it. Who'd like to start?
I'll go.
Great.
I have to say that a lot of my science fiction is fandom is more sort of action oriented and political sci-fi and that sort of stuff. So this was not normally the type of science fiction I would pick up, I don't think. So I loved that this was impetus to get me to read a style of book that I might not normally do, despite its queer centricness. And what I found fascinating was that it was riveting for me all the way through, despite the fact that it wasn't really an event-based book. It was a relationship-based story, just about the development of these characters, and you got to explore their cultures through the viewpoint of each of the characters. And I thought that was fascinating. And the author is terrific at not giving what we call info dumps, that you get to a chapter and a new alien species is there, and it's like 16 pages of information of the things that race or species eats, and how they view religion and marriage and all sorts of stuff. No, we just got to view all of that through these characters coming to know each other, and especially the viewpoint of the new character to the ship. So she was sort of our viewpoint, both into the world and the story. And I thought it was fascinating, and that sure, there were some events and things that happened, plot points that keep it moving forward, but it was still predominantly character and relationship driven rather than action and event driven. And so that's something I certainly appreciated from it. And all the queer themes and whatnot, of course, are front and center, but I can chat about those later. Let somebody else chat.
Jim, I agree with you. I thought, I mean, almost all sci-fi that I've ever come to always has like a lot of action and just so much science to go with the fiction. And I really enjoyed how character-based this was. And I was joking with my wife that this is like a palate cleanser in space, but it's like a planet cleanser, so I really enjoyed it, and it was cool to just get to know all these people, or these people. They're people.
Sure, up in here.
Yeah.
I also liked it for that reason. I also like how the main action that did happen was all at the end of the book, but it didn't feel rushed, and it didn't feel like she put it in just because she felt like it needed action. Like, it actually made sense. And I love that about the book. And her other works are also very similar, where it's just like you're living a day in the life in space. And it's like, I want to live a day in the life in space. It's so cool.
Well, the first question, I'd like to just read a little excerpt from the book. And it's from kind of early in the book when Ashby, who's the captain of the ship, is talking about sharing profits to support everyone who's involved. So the quote starts here. Ashby scratched his beard and thought, what did he want it for? After he'd first left home all those years ago, he'd sometimes wondered if he'd go back to the fleet to raise kids, or if he'd settled down on a colony somewhere. But he was a spacer through and through, and he had the itch for drifting. As the years went on, the thought of making a family had dwindled. The point of a family, he'd always thought, was to enjoy the experience of bringing something new into the universe, passing your knowledge and seeing part of yourself live on. He'd come to realize that his life in the sky filled that need. He had a crew that relied on him and a ship that continued to grow and tunnels that would last for generations. To him, that was enough. So the question that came forward for that was, how did this book make you think about family and family of choice?
I'll go on this one because I thought it was just so interesting. Just the one nice thing about almost giving every character like a little slice all the way through was that you got to see kind of their approach to family without, like what Jim was saying earlier, the info dump about like, these are their beliefs and this is like, and so it's not like you have to spend the first 15 minutes of an episode of Star Trek where you learn about these new people or whatever. It came very organically. But I really loved the way that Sissix, like their approach to family and how it happens in like these like segmented ways throughout their lives. I just thought that that's such an interesting way to view how you come to family, and you could see that kind of reflected in chosen family and that stuff too. So.
I agree. I have to say that for me, that's one of the biggest, I think probably maybe most memorable takeaways is Sissix and their species methodology of, hatching families, and that just because the genetic parents don't raise you, you're raised by this other, you're the feather family, I think it was. And then you can go out and have found family, but it doesn't take, each of those types of family doesn't take away from the other type of family. And they all exist in those characters or that species, way of life. And that's something sort of I explore in my own life. I have a tremendous family, birth family and stuff. But I also have a tremendous found family of friends in a close-knit group. And I don't feel like one takes away from the other. And I feel like sometimes that's something a lot of people feel, the pull between one or the other, that if they're paying more attention to one, that means it's taking away from another. So I thought this was a really lovely illustration of different sort of child rearing concepts and family styles. And I personally really loved it.
I like how in depth it went into each family. It wasn't just like, oh, this is like what the person is like. It's like, this is why this person is this way. Like with Jenks being like smaller, and everybody thought it was like a genetic defect, but it was just like his mom chose to keep him that way, and then he wanted to stay that way. And then with Sissix, when like Rosemary went to look up who her feather family was, and she was like, oh, it's all of us, like she chose us to be her family. And I just thought that was so beautiful.
Do you all feel like you would have fit in with the crew?
I would have wanted to.
Yeah, that would have been awesome.
Yeah.
Did you have any sort of just impressions about them as a group and as a crew? Or
for me, it was like a dream episode of Firefly written by a queer person. Like that it was like being like held by our own community through a TV show that is beloved. Like I just loved it.
I think one thing, both the author herself, I was reading some stuff about her. She said she was heavily inspired by Farscape, a TV show, which I am currently in the process of, my once every few years rewatch of it. And that TV show is very similar in terms of sort of chosen family tone. Here's the human thrown in with all these other people, many of whom are aliens or alien to them. And they have to learn how to work and operate together. And I thought I would certainly love to be on that crew. And I thought it was fascinating that the tension in the prose and in the plot came from characters' interactions rather than from, well, I mean, of course, they were out, when the ship gets invaded, and of course, there were plot devices to create external tension, but so much, and it wasn't tension as in fighting necessarily, even though, what's his name, Corbin, the algae guy, he's set up to be unlikable, but kind of in the end, he makes a choice that you go, I think if I were in Corbin's position, I would be hard pressed not to make the same choice. I feel, and so I just thought it was tremendous, the exploration of each of those characters in their own way, and then most of them, they got to see how they viewed most of the other characters from their point of view. I just loved it.
Oh, that's great. Casey, did you have a thought or?
I just love how accepting they were, like almost immediately. Everybody was like, yeah, we've all got our things going on. Like everybody has their own story, but like we're all just trying to live life the best we can. And they were like really accommodating of each other and really open with each other.
Were there any characters on the Wayfarer that you really empathized with specifically?
I love Dr. Chef. I also love that whole species can like, they move in and out of different genders. I thought that was like such a cool concept.
Yeah, their lifespan or their life process. They start out female and become male, and so again that affected how they viewed parenting and family rearing and all that sort of stuff. I think I certainly identify with Captain Ashby. I feel like I most often in life end up in the leadership roles, and I feel like in most books that media, whether it's books or TV or movies, the captain is always this has to be super macho or super strong and confident and powerful or competent or something like that. I felt like Ashby was just this normal dude trying to make sure everybody was having a great life, that they could all do their jobs, so they could all get paid, so they could continue to have the life that they were choosing. And I thought he was a tremendous example of a leader character that didn't have to be, James Kirk over the top or Captain Mal Reynolds from Firefly, sort of, kooky over the top. And I thought that was a really bold choice to just make him a normal dude that's really great at accommodating and understanding everybody's needs and or desires and doing the best he can to make it all work for everyone. And then they all work together to do a job. I thought that was a tremendous example of, I don't know what the term is, maybe it was sort of soft leadership, but doesn't mean it's weak or ineffective.
So I just have to insert here for a minute that when I was in junior high, there were reruns of Star Trek on after school, and I never missed an episode because I had such a crush on Jim Kirk. Anyway, it was like a highlight. So I can hold that up. Sarah, did you have a character that you really related to?
I don't even know if it's necessarily like a one-to-one relation, but going back to the Firefly thing, I think that Kizzy and being so similar to the way Kaylee is in Firefly, it's just nice to have that character in around the ship and just be so competent. And really, that's kind of the way I felt about like almost all of just any like even sort of woman-identified person in this universe all had some cool thing that they were able to do and stuff, and like I just loved all that. So all of it.
From a sci-fi perspective too, I feel like it's a little bit more rare to get that sort of in-depth character development from the female characters. So I was just like, I was eating it up. I loved it.
So I was going to say, for Sarah and Casey, from the female perspective, we're ever since Sigourney Weaver on Aliens and stuff, that was our first example of that the female heroine who could be strong and competent, wasn't defined by her relationships or a man or something. And I guess that sort of goes back to the captain thing too. So there was an example of a character that had to be defined by their overbearing strength and confidence and competence. And I think I agree with you that all of these female or female identifying characters are just showed such great range and were not, again, dumped into a cliche. And so for you guys, I know you just said that, Casey, that must be really rewarding.
Well, I mean, the thing about Alien too is that Ripley, the whole point, the first one, she goes around being correct the entire time and nobody believes her. And so just watching that, you're just like, somebody believe her, please.
Yeah.
And so it's nice to not have to have that like present in the story either. So
I also like that Pei, Ashby's like girlfriend or whatever, was like way cooler than Ashby was.
Right? She's like Gina, what's her name? On Firefly. You're like, oh, I want to be her.
Yeah, she's like super
Just
hot.
fucking cool. Yeah.
So you made me think of a funny thing that when Sigourney Weaver was filming Alien, she kept, when she had to shoot people, she'd scream, Rambolina. But anyway,
I didn't know that.
There's been some more people who've joined us. And I just, we're the Read It or Don't book group from the Center on Colfax, and we're talking about The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. I was going to read another little quote here that I thought was interesting. This is again from early in the book. Living in space was anything but quiet. Grounders never expected that. For anyone who had grown up planet-side, it took some time to get used to the clicks and hums of a ship, the ever-present ambience that came with living inside a piece of machinery. But to Ashby, those sounds were as ordinary as his own heartbeat. He could tell when it was time to wake by the sigh of the air filter over his bed. When rocks hit the outer hull with their familiar pattering, he knew which were small enough to ignore and which meant trouble. He could tell by the amount of static crackling over the Ansible how far he was from the person on the other end. These were the sounds of spacer life, an underscore of vulnerability and distance. They were reminders of what a fragile thing it was to be alive. But those sounds also meant safety. An absence of sound meant that air was no longer flowing, engines no longer running, aerograph nets no longer holding your feet to the floor. Silence belonged to the vacuum outside. Silence was death. I thought that was really interesting, and I think that it sort of talked about how people really relied on each other and how they relied on the ship. So do you feel like everyone was kind of each other's lifeline in a way, or what are your thoughts on that?
I would certainly agree with that. And I think that passage in particular really speaks to how clearly she describes, especially there's the Star Trek method where you've got crew, or Battlestar Galactica, you've got these massive crews all having to work together on a big carrier ship. And then you've got the Firefly, Farscape, and this sort of example where you've got a small, tight crew. I think it really illustrates the notion of how interdependent they are. Not on, oh, the engineering department will take care of that. No, it's freaking Kizzy or Jenks is going to have to fix that. And if they're both incapacitated for some reason, we're a little foobarred. So I think it really delightfully illustrates how responsible they are to each other as they are to their jobs, because their jobs are keeping the others alive or keeping the process functioning or the job moving forward. So I think Becky Chambers is brilliant. The whole book illustrates that whole notion.
I also love passages like that because it makes you feel like you're like in space, like you would know what it would be like to travel through space, and like how your body kind of acclimates to those sorts of things, and like what becomes the new normal, especially if it's like the only thing you've ever known, like it is for those characters.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of that, Casey, like I think if you talk with anybody about this book, they immediately talk about the characters, you know what I mean? But there's such good world building in this book too. And so those passages really do make you feel like you're there and you're breathing the air, like they're breathing the air and that stuff. So.
And it's world building without being most of it without being obvious world building.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love the parts where they like touch down on the other planets for that reason as well, especially the Junker planet with like the stinky air and stuff, and like how it affected the different species in different ways, because that's also character building and world building at the same time. And I think she's just like really brilliant at that.
Agreed.
Very interesting. Do you think that this book could be a step to understanding sexual or gender identity to anyone who might be wanting to understand it in a non-traditional way?
Absolutely. I think it can be. I think speaking as somebody who's writing some science fiction, both for board games and the associated stories that go with it, I'm exploring some of that exact same stuff. I feel like the step that I've taken is taken it to what is society, is a galactic society like that has moved past all of what we're currently in our lifetimes, sort of dealing with. I feel like what Becky Chambers has done is managed to give us a futuristic setting, but a lot of the passages are talking about characters. They're still like self-aware of pronoun usage, even though it's my belief that if you've been doing this stuff for a couple hundred years, you're just acclimating to that. You wouldn't think about it and call it out in your head, saying, "Oh, I have to remember to use they, them, or z, or z, they for the really angry aliens." I've forgotten what they were called. So I think this work in particular makes it relevant for a contemporary reader to read it, because these characters call out, even if it's internally for themselves, those thought processes that we all currently are going through as society is trying to acclimate to even just using they, them, let alone anything else. So I think she's done a wonderful job at using this as a vehicle for people to help see some examples of how it can be, and the processes that people might actually be going through as they're trying to use like pronouns properly.
Yeah, you guys are just setting it up so good for my next little comments. But there's so much dystopian sci-fi right now, and we're just kind of like and maybe we're living in a dystopia right now. But it's kind of nice to see what it could be in like a positive way, and it's almost, I don't know, when I see critiques about this book and they're like, there's just not enough plot, or like, bleh, I'm always like, okay, this is like an episode of Schitt's Creek or Ted Lasso in space. Like, it's meant to just be, it could be like this, and it could be that people could be like this with each other, and it could be, so I really appreciated that.
If I'm recalling correctly, she also like goes into this in her other books as well, in terms of like gender identity and stuff like that. But part of what I love about sci-fi and fantasy is that you aren't bound by current socio-political rules. It can be whatever you imagine it to be, and a lot of folks like Kim Stanley Robinson does it really well.
Mm-hmm.
Gender doesn't matter. Like, and our current society puts so much emphasis on gender and gender roles. So to like see a society or a picture of a society or an idea of a society where those things don't like matter, and you can transition in and out of those things so easily. Like, if men wanted to, they could become a woman and bear children. And if women wanted to, they could like become a man. And like, it's not even a second thought. It's just like, it is what it is. And like with Dr. Chef, like, it's completely normal for Dr. Chef to like go through both like an egg-laying female phase or childbearing female phase, and then transition into the dormant male phase. And I just think that like things like that are so cool to think about, and like so freeing to think about.
You know, one thing that I kind of am curious about as you were talking is oftentimes, whether it's in gaming or if it's in sci-fi or other areas, sometimes women are really singled out specifically for a lot of ugly treatment. And I think I was really interested in what you said, Sarah, about like, this is Ted Lasso in space, you know. So I guess I'm wondering what you kind of think about, you know, there's just some people who would just reject a woman as an author of sci-fi, and you know, I'm just curious what people have thoughts about that. You know, if it's different from a lot of other sci-fi, like you were mentioning, Jim, that, you know, does it hold its own? Is sort of, I guess, my question.
I certainly think it does, and I find I'm just dismissive of people who are dismissive of an author because of their gender or their race or something. anybody can write anything. And when it comes to sci-fi, who can, from my point of view, I'm like, I don't care that it's a woman. Give me some good characters and a good story, or at least enough of each component that I enjoy the experience. And so it is eternally frustrating that people are still going to say, well, women shouldn't be writing sci-fi, or even other people, even I would imagine there's some women too, that say, oh, well, it's because it doesn't have enough plot. And that's not the point of this. The plot is the characters' relationships and, the experiences of the job they're going on to this small angry planet. It's about the journey, not necessarily the destination. So then you get some action beats, like you said, at the end, but that's not the point of the story. And not every story needs to be that point, because then every story is going to be so similar, we're going to get tired of it. And I do love that because when you said it was like Schitt's Creek in space, and that is one of the brilliant things about Schitt's Creek. It's just about these characters who accept each other for who they are. And yeah, especially with Daniel, is very queer centric, but it's not a highlighted issue. It's not a point of contention for either the family members or, for the most part, even the society. And that's the same thing that's depicted here. It's just part of the society. These species behave this way and rear their children that way and treat gender those ways. Who cares? And so anyway, I'm talking enough.
Any other thoughts that anybody'd like to share? Or no, we're good. Okay. Well, there was one other quote here, and this is from Jenks. There were other Lovelaces out there, of course. Her core software platform could be purchased through any AI dealer. There were probably dozens of versions of her traveling through the galaxy, maybe hundreds, who knew? But they weren't her. The Lovey that Jenks knew was uniquely molded by the Wayfarer. Her personality had been shaped by every experience she and the crew had together, every place they'd been, every conversation they'd shared. And honestly, Jenks thought, couldn't the same be said for organic people? Weren't they all born running the same basic human starter platform, which was shaped and changed as they went along? In Jenks' eyes, the only real difference in cognitive development between humans and AIs was that of speed. He'd had to learn to walk and talk and eat all the other essentials before he'd begun to have a sense of identity. Lovely didn't have to worry about those things. There hadn't been a need for her to spend years learning how to monitor systems or switch off circuits. She'd started life out with all the maturity and knowledge she'd needed to do her job competently. But in the 3 standards since she'd been installed, she'd become much more than that, and much more than just the ship's AI. She'd become someone wonderful. It looks like Sarah liked that part.
I don't know. There's just something about the conversation. And really, honestly, for as much as we're like, it's utopian and everybody is so great and so accepting or whatever, that conversation about AI is just such an interesting one in the book. And to have this relationship between Jinx and Lovey and then see what happens at the end is, I don't know, it was an emotional moment.
It was. And I have to say that is the one slice of sort of plot / world building development that she put into this that brings us back to our interaction with our current world, is that you see, essentially egalitarian and utopian interactions between all these different species and characters. But then when Ashby is at the council at the end recounting the event, I said we lost a member of the crew, and so much of that council was dismissive of the AI being considered crew. They go, oh, yep, that's what we still feel today in many different ways. And that was the one slice that shows this slice of this imaginary galaxy world building stuff still has some room to grow, because that's not a universal truth within that existence, that AIs are universally considered and treated as potential equal people.
Well, there's a little bit there that makes me want to ask, do you feel that is sort of analogous to any of the different issues we've seen around equality now that we're facing. Specifically, we talk about LGBTQ equality, but I think that it may have a lot of impact on other discussions about equality, and curious about your impressions on that.
Well, I certainly think so, and I think that was the direct analogy in this book, Lois, whereas all the others are, like what I was alluding to earlier, she set up a system where most of the societies and individuals had moved past most of the things, gender and species differences and whatnot, but we still got a little bit of it, and it wasn't really explored, and it wasn't a huge plot device. It was because it affects Jenks in specific because of his relationship to the AI, to Lovey. But I think it's a direct analogy to what we're experiencing, racially, queerly, all the sort of things we're still looking for equality and egalitarianism in.
I also thought it was kind of interesting because Lovey was, in my opinion, the least delved into of all of the people on the ship, and I wasn't sure if that was intentional or not. It probably was, but then I felt like really personally impacted by the end of the story when Lovey was the only one who ended up being lost, and Jinx's reaction to that, and then Pepper's proposal at the end, and I guess now at that point she was Lovely's, her decision to then go so soon after she had been rebooted, she was already capable of thinking in that way and comprehending emotions and whatnot in that way. And her story does continue in the next book.
Oh, does it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that makes it that much more impactful than to know that it is carried on and not just, oh, hey, she became a new, different person from Lovey, and hi, bye.
Yeah.
So that is good to know that that's followed up on.
So switching gears a little bit, just curious why you think that Ashby was revered as a captain by his crew, and was he a captain that you would follow?
I'll go again.
Yeah.
I feel like my default first speak. I don't. Anyway, I think from what I said earlier is I feel like he's that soft leader that's doing what's best for both the job, and in this case, the ship and the crew all sort of are one thing together. You disregard the job, and then you're negatively affecting the crew. You disregard the ship, and then the crew can't do the job, all that sort of stuff. So I think, as I said earlier, I think it's a wonderful depiction of a different kind of leader that we don't often get in science fiction or most anything else, really, for that matter. And at least the way it was depicted in the story, I still felt he was effective and therefore revered by the crew, even if it took them some time to understand come to respect his methodology and why it seemed to work. And I think that's also why Pei loved him too.
You're talking first, Jim, because you're our Ashby.
Damn it.
No,
Just
so
one
good.
time I don't want to be Ashby.
You got it. It's that beard. You got it.
I also like that it felt like it was a non-hierarchical structure within the crew, which you don't see a lot of, and it can be hard to kind of picture that sometimes because we are so entrenched in kind of a hierarchical, patriarchal kind of a society structure. So to see something outside of that where it is still a male identifying person who's leading the crew, but that has nothing to do with it. He's still just doing I don't want to say servant leadership because it sounds really cheesy, but that is kind of what it is. He finds the needs of his crew and then makes sure that those are met so that the crew can do their job well.
Love that. Yes.
Sounds like there's a lot that we can learn.
Yeah. So actually maybe this is a question for you, for Sarah and Casey. Do you feel that because yet again here's a captain of a starship is a cisgendered male character? Was that at first you're going, oh God, are we gonna have another one of these? Or was his depiction delivered in such a way that it wasn't off-putting, or are you even off-put by that? I'm presuming. So.
I typically I'm a bit of a cynic. So I was a little bit like, okay, let's see where this goes. But then I was pleasantly surprised along the way. And I was super stoked with the author's choice of just like crew and like how well they meshed and how they met each other's needs and how kind they were to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Can I be honest and tell you, before I read the book, I saw something about the book and I was very confused that they had a pilot and a captain. And so I was like, wait a second, hold on now. But then when I read it, it made sense. But yeah, so.
I disown you. You're a bad sci-fi nerd if that's what cracks you up. Unfriend.
No.
I also loved how he handled Corbin.
Yes. I mean, he knew, because again, Corbin brought a particular value and skill set to the ship that no one else had. And he was doing work that one can presume no one else really wanted to do, let alone had the skills to do. And so he was as vital as every other single character. Mm-hmm. And I think that was part of the development for Rosemary too. She comes in and they're going, we're kind of saddled with having to have this archiver. But then, of course, she proves the efficacy of not only herself and her skill sets, but Corbin in particular, and he's set up to be unlikable. Mm-hmm. And I love when finally, it was later in the book, we finally get to see when there's his big revelation. We get to understand a little bit more where that comes from, and he discovers it for himself too. Realizes, so having not read the rest of the books, I would presume that there's some additional character development or evolution for him, just because if he's discovering who and what he is, and maybe he won't be such an off-putting person. Mm-hmm. And I think Ashby's ability to deal with that and make sure that it was mitigated as much as possible in his interactions with the other crew helped keep Corbin being effective, doing his job that was vital to, again, the crew, the ship, and the mission. Mm-hmm. And so I think, again, that speaks really highly to how she creates Ashby as this soft leader. He doesn't have to rarely did he have to demand things of people. But he could just he understood the situation, so he could sort of guide it and make sure it's handled the way that he saw was best.
I also think it was interesting how Corbin became one of the most complex characters, like 3/4 of the way through the book. And then it's also like really easy with Corbin specifically to be like, how would you respond if you were in his shoes, especially at the end with the final decision that he made, because at that point he really had nothing to lose. Right. And so I don't know, because I don't know what I would do in that situation. He made a really tough call. And then I felt myself breathe a sigh of relief, because of course he was the only one who could do that, or who would do that.
Right. And I think I said that earlier too. I feel like he made the decision that I would have gone, you know what? I'm in a position where I have nothing to lose. There's only stuff for whether it's he himself or sort of the situation to gain. So there he goes and does it. And you feel like, oh, he's making a very aware and bold choice, mm-hmm. Knowing that it may very well make him, at least in the eyes of, I'm drawing a blank on his name.
Ohan?
Ohan, thank you. Very well may completely and totally alienate him and whatever relationship he could have with Ohan. But it would, and so it's nice to see that sort of looks like it's resolving itself too. And I definitely found myself identifying with that, going, I can see I'd be doing it. I know everybody hates me anyways, so what's one more?
And I did cry when Ohan was like, I think I'd like to eat with my crew. And then Dr. Chef got so happy.
You can see all his hand feet clapping. I'm going to make you so much food.
Yeah, I was like, oh, my heart.
Yeah.
I got one more quote from the book. And I'll just read it here. She would never, ever understand the idea that a child, especially an infant, was of more value than an adult who'd already gained all the skills needed to benefit the community. The death of a new hatchling was so common as to be expected. The death of a child, about to feather, yes, that was sad, but a real tragedy was the loss of an adult with friends and lovers and family. The idea that a loss of potential was somehow worse than a loss of achievement and knowledge was something she had never been able to wrap her brain around.
I'm going again on this. I thought that was one of the most, for me, one of the most brilliant little pieces of exposition of how family and child rearing and all that stuff can be viewed differently. And I think maybe that's analogous and can speak to the whole continued abortion debate in this country and whatnot, and women's rights to choose for their own bodies and stuff. So speaking as a childless person and somebody who doesn't like children, and there's children around, I appreciated this depiction of this culture that said, you know what? Some of our kids die because it's just nature. Not everything is fit or necessarily needs to progress on through its stages of life. And I love the whole concept, or that the whole part of that quote about potential can be valued more than contribution, or whatever that the other word was. And that's right. We should, we're so, in our culture, it seems like so many people are so quick to disregard, the elderly. But what have so many of them done for us to get us to this point? We're so easy to just shunt them off into an old folks' home and forget about them because it's all about the children, the children, the children. Children haven't done anything yet, and they're a renewable resource. And so it was sort of kind of depicted in that way for this particular species, that's very much how they viewed it. They go, I dropped 6 eggs, they all hatched, and 2 of them make it to adulthood. And look, one of them's a great engineer, and one's a great pilot or artisan, or whatever it is they choose to do with their lives. And that's what's valued. And I thought it was a tremendous and bold sort of depiction, especially from a female author, where people would think, how can a woman say something like that? Because children are supposed to be the most valuable and precious resource in all of existence. So I kudos to her again for depicting that, I think.
Go ahead, Casey.
I also thought it was a really interesting narrative on grief, and just like how grief impacts different cultures. It may just be like the last year has me thinking a lot about grief, but I also liked it for the same reasons that you did, Jim, because so often it is about the loss of potential, and she just like phrased it perfectly, because it's like the loss of potential versus the loss of accomplishments and like community and people who have like established themselves and contributed in ways that like children are not able to. But then also from the perspective of like an egg-bearing sentient creature who you eat eggs, like you eat chicken eggs all the time. They're not fertilized.
We're eating potential.
Yeah.
I'm having scrambled potential this morning with some bacon.
Yeah, and like the fact that like the humans on the ship were like really, really caught up in it, which I thought was interesting as well. Because I would be too if like I saw this like how like if I saw somebody like interact with their child at like they like didn't care, like they were like somebody like an acquaintance, I would be like, what the heck, that's weird. But it's like totally normal for different societies, and it was just like a fascinating look into that. And I think without that too, that society just would have been like an orgy society, and that would have been like what it was known for. But this added so much complexity to it. Right,
it adds so much depth to that society, because you see that. I mean, speaking as somebody who's adopted, I can imagine that, and my partner's mother has a child she gave up for adoption, and only in recent few years has actually made contact with. So I can imagine that I see that this is a little bit of an analogy to that too. Sometimes you make a choice to give up a child, somebody else has reared it and educated it and allowed it to grow into a person. And those people should be applauded for taking what you created and making something out of it. I think this is a nice way to sort of revere that process as well.
That's so true.
Yeah. So I just think, again, that's another brilliant slice of sort of world building that she put into this, I think. Sarah? Nothing.
Well, I think in some ways there might be one question though to kind of build out further, because I think it's interesting the points being made about children, but it also just might be discounting relationships and just how people love one another. And in a traditional view, one way of loving might be valued above others, but why does that make this other way of loving invalid?
Okay.
No, I'm gonna not this time.
She's
Jim.
going for it.
Not this time. I think what you're actually like kind of touching on is really like an overall theme in this book, where it's like you can't center your own experience as normalcy, because there's just so many other experiences out there, and they're all just as normal and just as valid as the others.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Amen to that, sister. What was I? That derailed. That was great. That derailed my thought. Oh, I know what I was going to say. So, at least as I was reading it, you reading it. Oh, this whole Jenks and Kizzy relationship is meant to be. Oh, they're the great heteronormative love relationship to this, and no, it's not. At least as we define it in our culture. And their whole discussion at the end where it's just, no, you're my brother, this brother that the brother I never had. That whole, it could have come off as so cliche, but I don't think it was at all. But just good that they have this deep and meaningful and passionate relationship, but it's not the whole man woman must get together and procreate sort of relationship. And I thought that was a lovely little sort of subversion of expectation.
Well, we have just a few minutes left, so I did want to I'm so happy to hear how much everybody really liked this book and what a good time you had reading it. Can any of you recommend any other books that you think, people who liked this, that they might also like? Just curious about your thoughts on that one.
Casey, you're the library person. I've got a couple things. I have to look one up because I can't remember the name of it.
I know. I just keep going dark. Like all the ones I want to recommend are like darker themes, darker stories. But there are a few neurodivergent sci-fi stories that I really love. River Solomon is a non-binary queer author of color who does sci-fi, and they wrote a book called An Unkindness of Ghosts that. It's like if society had to go to space right now and then decided to lean in to racism in a ship with caste societies, essentially. And it's from the perspective of a neurodivergent person, and it is so good. And then there's another one that I can't remember the name of, but it takes place in the Netherlands, and the apocalypse is happening right now. Earth is getting bombarded by asteroids from a neurodivergent perspective as well, about the journey to getting onto a ship and what it looks like to get a spot on a ship, and being able to navigate through that with a mother who is addicted to drugs, a sister who is missing during an apocalyptic event. And it's if I can think of the name of it, I'll share that.
Well, but the author of both of them was River Sullivan?
Rivers Solomon is only the author of the first
one.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Jim, did you find the name of the book you were looking for?
I did not, because I can remember neither, and it's on my iPad, which is way on the other side of the house, but it's a whole science fiction series about futuristic colonization of humanity and other species that they come across. But again, with the gender thing that it deals with is that because there's sort of defeated aging, and you can, I don't remember it necessarily being cloning, but you can keep your body alive for centuries. And sometimes you go, you know what, for the next couple of years that I'm feeling the lady vibe. So they undergo the transition surgery to become a woman for X amount of time, and then maybe a few years later, maybe a couple hundred years later, they go, no, I'm going to go back to being the man thing. And it was a whole. And I'm so sorry I can't think of either the author. And I want to say there was something about the game. One of the first books in the series was about this big game that's sort of played, and it's got ring worlds and all sorts of stuff. So, but it was one of those things that certainly explored how gender fluidity can just be normal. Unlike we're currently going through, people can change. They don't feel like they're one thing that they were born with, and it's causing issues amongst people. And so this is a great depiction of where we could evolve towards that. Sure, you can spend part of your life one way and another part of your life another way, and it literally doesn't matter because it has no impact upon anything else other than your own personal choice or feelings. And then my other thing is the Expanse series, where there's the TV shows which do a great job of interpreting the books, but the books, of course, have so much more in them. And they do, even though it's not necessarily queer centric, again, it's all in there and just presented as normal, and it's not something to be called out. And those are the depictions I think our society and culture can or maybe need or will grow from, is just having more depictions in our fiction and our media of what, once we get through this hump and these growth spurts of understanding neurodivergent issues, gender issues, what can society potentially look like when we're no longer caught up and hung up on these things. And so that's where I think the value of a lot of this entertainment media can provide, is let's show some examples of how we imagine things could be when we're not struggling with this anymore.
You're right. Both great recommendations from both of you. Good work. Mine isn't so much just like a singular book. Mine is more like an assignment that I want somebody to do. Like, I would really love if somebody would start a podcast where they just go through Ender's Game through a queer lens, just like really just queer the hell out of Ender's Game. Just number one, to really just look at it through like every chapter and kind of go through like, what are the queer things like that we could glean from this chapter? Just number one, because I think it would really, really upset Orson Scott Card. And
he's Mormon. So.
We need to just upset the heck out of him. But then also just because I remember reading it when I was younger and just thinking it was like the coolest thing ever. And it would be so much nicer if I could, have a discussion or in a podcast way, listen to a discussion about people who are reading it the same way that I read it, or in a way that disrupts it. I don't know, in a way, just reapproach it.
Huh. I was like, do you think there's queer stuff to
That's
glean
my recommendation.
from that?
If people don't do it a week from today, that'll be my new podcast, and you'll see it next Friday on Spotify and anywhere else that you listen to podcasts.
Well, that's exciting. I can't wait for that podcast. That sounds like a lot of fun.
I'll do it with you, Sarah.
Before we go, I just want to make sure that folks know we have one more of these book events that's going to stream next month in November. And the next month's book is called A Two-Spirit Journey, the autobiography of a lesbian Ojibwa Cree elder by Mani Chakabi. So we'll have more information about that at the Center on Colfax website, lgbtqcolorado.org, and hope that folks who tuned in tonight will tune into that. I want to thank all three of you for just making a really lively, fun discussion, and for just sharing your enthusiasm for this great book and being here. So really appreciate all three of you being part of the discussion, and I hope you all have a great night, and thanks again for participating.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Well,
the book is On the Edge of Gone.
There you go.
Found it.
Thanks for finding that. And I hope you all have a great night. And thanks everybody who tuned in. And hope to see some of you next month for our next book. All righty. Bye-bye.
Good night.